So our reading is Isaiah chapter 60. We had a reading earlier on from one of the earlier chapters in Isaiah. We're looking at Isaiah 60 as a chapter today, but we're reading just now together the first 6 verses. Arise, shine, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. The Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see, they all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hill. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, praises of the Lord. You'll remember, we're usually told, your first day of doing something new. My first day here at Tuckingmill was technically the 1st of January 2005. But that being New Year's Day, I didn't properly start work until the 2nd of January, Sunday. To be quite honest, I remember very little of the services here that Sunday. I do remember it was Jenny's 50th birthday. Going way further back, I don't remember anything at all about my first day at primary school. I do have some memories of starting my secondary school, which was over at Truro. The first day, though, is still a bit of a blur. I really only remember being rather lost around what seemed to me, on that occasion, to be a vast area of random corridors and funny shaped open spaces. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, someone had been appointed to make sure that I got from school across the town and up to Truro Station. There it is. It didn't look even quite as swish as that in those days, I promise you. And the right train, because of course trains go in both directions, actually 3 directions to Truro. I needed the train to get back home to Redruth. I apologise for all of those here who are Camborne people. I'm featuring so much of Redruth today, but please let me off. I really hadn't had much experience with trains at that point of my life. It would soon become just part of the daily routine for the next 7 or 8 years. I don't remember much about that first trip home, to be honest. On that first day at the new school, what I remember most was the second day and the trip home. On that second day, I was much more on my own. I managed to follow the crowd across town at the end of the day, and got up to the station. And I got onto what I thought was the right train. But was it? So the train pulled out of the station, and it went through that short tunnel, you know, at the top of the hill that leads under the road. And I thought I remembered that. And on the other side of the tunnel, looking off to the left, there was New County Hall, and it was new in those days, just a few years new. Yeah, I thought I remembered that too. But then the train proceeded on. Now I realise it was down the hill at beyond the way, well, 3 miles down, is growing down in that way through Green Bottom, then swerving over towards Chasewater, and yeah, there was that old station platform at Chasewater, and I thought I remembered that too. I wasn't really sure. I was becoming less and less sure about things. It's just a disused station. I'm sure there are disused stations in the other direction as well. I'm really not sure that I'm going in the right direction. The other kids who should be with me on this train. I don't see them here. Have I just got onto the wrong train? And countryside seemed to blur more and more as the speed picked up. And of course, it was eventually zooming along what I would now call Scoria Straits, but I didn't recognise it at that time. I had no real idea where I was. Eventually, and it was only a few minutes later, of course, but to me it seemed like eventually the train started to slow, and that could be familiar. There was a bridge over what might have been Drunk Road in Madrid, if you know that. And yeah, I think I recognise that because I used to walk up that way to go to my first primary school, the East End. And shortly after that, there is you go into, it seems like a long tunnel. It's not actually a tunnel all the way through, but buildings sort of grow up on either side. Eventually, there is that tunnel underneath the Route Westling, and finally, the train came to a halt, and yes, it was Redrick Station. Finally, I had my bearings again. I knew where I was, home, well, at least after a walk across town. Strangely enough, though, reading Isaiah 60 put me in mind of that train journey from way, way back half a century ago. We start off knowing at least roughly where we are in God's scheme of things, in Isaiah chapter 60, just from the context of the book. And then there are those curious other bits that might well stick in your minds too. When you see, for example, this in verse 6, they shall bring gold and frankincense. Now, come on, who of you can read that? When I read it out earlier, who of you did that not ring bells for? Sweet Christmas bells, even. Of course, gold and frankincense. We think of Christmas. Even if you do wonder what happened to the myrrh. But as the passage proceeds, I can quite understand if you feel you have lost your bearings. I didn't read on past that bit. But it's like trees and valleys and stream down there, whizzing past the railway windows. Not at all sure what to make of them. It doesn't seem really familiar territory. Do we know where we're going? So you get verse 13, for example, middle of the chapter. The glory of Lebanon shall come to you, the cypress, the plane, and the pine, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will make the place of my feet glorious. What's that all about? Finally, you start to hear things. You think, I recognize that, but how on earth did I get here? Because that doesn't sound like Isaiah. This starts to sound like, oh, what does it sound like to you? Isaiah 60, verse 19, nearly at the end of the chapter. The sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. What does that sound like? Revelation, isn't it? That last book of the Bible. How did we get there from Isaiah 60? Actually, precisely how we get there is not the biggest deal to work out. We just need to be encouraged that on God's journey down through history, just like that train journey I told you about, don't worry, stayed on track the whole way. Isaiah 60 starts with a possible hint of Christmas when we think about he who has been born to the Jews. But it ends up securely at the other end of the line at the time and place when we see this Jesus enthroned as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Even if the journey today will remain in your mind as a bit of a blur. Would you like to travel with me? I haven't actually given out notes with headings. And they're not very spiritual. It says leaving Truro, somewhere around Chasewater, and then finally approaching Madrid. So leaving Truro. And yes, if you're being pedantic, that train is going in the wrong direction. That's another train on platform 3. So here we are, Isaiah 60, verse 1. Rise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Think of that star of Bethlehem, perhaps. Though maybe we're talking about the Christmas card version. As we have no idea whether it was an actual star or comet, or planetary conjunction, or something else. But we think in terms of a bright light shining up there in a sky that is dark. And that's what we get in Isaiah. A sky that is dark. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. That's the background in Isaiah 60. You go back a chapter, after all, Isaiah compiled and composed his writings in this particular order, things are pretty grim. See how Isaiah 59 starts. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, or his ear dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. And that could be individual, or it could be collective as a nation. You read on and you see definitely there is the national side of this featuring in verses 14 and 15. Justice is turned back and righteousness stands far away, for truth has stumbled in the public squares and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. The Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. And yet, despite this theological bleak midwinter, there are preparations for Christmas. Read on another verse. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. We're told something of those preparations for the evils. Verse 20, and a redeemer will come to Zion to those in Jacob who turn from transgression, declares the Lord. And so the darkness will not have the final word. Isaiah 60 verse 2, for behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. If I remember right, darkness shall cover the earth. Those are some of the opening words in Handel's Messiah. There's some very good theology kind of words, and the choice of those words in that musical work, by the way. And that takes me to John's Gospel too, doesn't it? John 1:9, the true light which gives light to everyone was coming into the world. The next verse in Isaiah is quite possibly what gave rise to the notion that those wise men, or those magi, who travelled to Bethlehem, were actually royal visitors. Isaiah 60 verse 3, nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. If your eyes flick down a couple of verses, as I've already said, you've got to think in terms of the gifts that those wise men brought. This up there for you, gold and frankincense. Surely, how can that not be some kind of illusion? Christmas, as was to be recorded 600 years later. And what it says about a multitude of camels. That's actually more like it. I know. Here's back to our Christmas card picture again. 3 guys on a camel each. No, nothing like that at all. We're not told it was 3 guys. I know you hear that from time to time. We're reminded that there were 3 gifts. We're not told there were 3 visitors. But if they were high up officials in the court of Persia, they wouldn't have come just 3 guys on their camels. They would have had a huge retinue. There would have been a large group of camels coming across the desert. So yes, I think we've left Truro Station and we've seen New County Hall and thought, yeah, I think I recognise this. But we're heading out into the wilds of Chasewater soon. You don't even have to go on much further in this chapter. A multitude of camels is one thing, but you get this. Lift up your eyes all around and see, they all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Now that certainly sounds like a substantial number of people coming, but not the court retinue of 3 or however many magi. Daughters carried on the hip. That sounds like baby daughters still being carried around by parents. So This now seems to be changing the picture into a movement of a substantial number of people. So that means probably that a multitude of camels. Well, it's not the transport for 3 wise men across the desert, but what would now be fleets or buses bringing hundreds, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Or maybe the container lorries bringing their supplies. As people by those multitudes are moving. And suddenly we feel, I suspect that we're on rather shaky ground, saying, what is all this about? What on earth is going on here? It would certainly fit with the history that we know. Israel as a nation invaded, huge numbers of people deported. It's what we call the exile in Babylon. And then God shakes up the world powers of that day. The new monarch comes to the throne and declares his new policy of repatriation. All these people that have been deported from their various countries, they can now go home. All of those people, or their descendants, can return to their national homelands. That might well fit with what Isaiah is saying here. And it will fit with other prophecies of that time as well. Isaiah 51, for example. The ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. But when it talks of everlasting joy shall be on their heads, they shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Maybe Israel returning to its own land doesn't seem quite enough, or a big enough fulfillment of this. And people have wondered whether those kind of prophecies refer to a re-establishment of a literal nation of Israel after the Second World War. Is that something predicted in these verses too? In that case, it wouldn't be just land transport that's needed. We're talking about something international, or even intercontinental, perhaps. And do you get that in Isaiah 60, verse 9? For the coastland shall hope for me. Coastlands, when you get it in Isaiah, probably means the most distant places you can draw on a map. The middle-aged maps would have said, here be dragons. Those kind of places. The ships of Tarshish first. Those were ships, the trading ships of those days, to bring your children from afar. Their silver and gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has made you beautiful. Is that what that's talking about? 1948? What is it that he's getting at? Is it his own time, 500 BC? Or is it for him far distant future? And still being, some people would argue, actively fulfilled today? Do we see here the involvement of other nations? The United Nations, actively establishing a new literal nation of Israel. Foreigners shall build up your walls, and their kings shall minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you, but in my favour I have had mercy. Folks, I confess that at times, when I try to get my head around this, I can't. I can't get it clear. I'm sceptical, I have to say, of many of the claims made about the new nation of Israel as a fulfillment of prophecy. But I still have to say, I think it fits to some extent. I also find it difficult to insist that when you read something like this, Isaiah 60, verse 5, then you shall see and be radiant, your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you, the wealth of the nations shall come to you. A standard line of interpreting that is saying, well, yeah, there's going to be lots of Gentiles who are converted, and Israel becomes the church. I don't really think that quite stacks up against what that says there. In fact, I find it hard to pin down pretty much anything in the middle of Isaiah chapter 60. I feel like I'm out there on the train, trees, fields, just whizzing past the window, but I'm not really sure whether I'm coming and going. It turns out that it must have been the the wilds somewhere near Chasewater even got as far as Storia, because as we read on, there are some signs that we are finally approaching Madrid. Or actually, we come even more home than we ever realised. It really does feel as if we're going down a dark tunnel and then arrive at something really very, very different and unexpected. And actually immensely glorious, even more so than Madrid Station with the Common Grey in the background. Listen up. Can you hear hints of what is ahead here? This is Isaiah still, Isaiah 60, verse 11. Your gates shall be open continually. Day and night they shall not be shut. The people may bring to you the wealth of the nations, with their kings led in procession. Does that ring any bells? Heard anything like that anywhere else? A city where there is no need of sun or moon to shine on it. The glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night. We'll flick through to nearly the end of Revelation again. So you turn your eye to that chapter of Revelation 21, and the next verse here, verse 26, will catch your eye and remind you again of Isaiah, perhaps. They will bring into it the glory and honour of the nations. That's the kind of stuff that we read back in Isaiah, but, well, 60 verse 13, the glory of Lebanon shall come to you, the cypress, the place of pine, to beautify the place of my sanctuary. I will make the place of my feet glorious. Now that, I'm pretty sure, is Isaiah harking back into history when they were building the temple in Jerusalem. And various of the woods from Lebanon were bought in at great price. Cypress, plane, and pine. But the New Jerusalem, that we read about in Revelation, does temple differently. The place where you meet with God, that's what the temple is about, all the way through the Bible. The place where you meet with God and he meets with you in Revelation is no longer a place, it's a person. So Revelation 21 says, I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb. I remember Isaiah spoke about sun and moon before. Back to Isaiah again. See how these verses from Isaiah 60 and Revelation 21 almost blur together. The sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Your sun shall no more go down, nor your moon withdraw its up. For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days and morning shall be ended. That's pretty much exactly what we read in Revelation 29. Not that there is no sun or moon, but there's no need of them. The city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it. And the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. But do you see what's happened here? Back in Isaiah 60. It looks to me as if Isaiah, in this prophecy, has managed to tunnel from his own times, giving us a glimpse in passing of the coming king, that mention of gold and frankincense. But he's managed to tunnel through all of our history, past and future, to give us a glimpse of what it will be like when the coming king not just comes for the first time, but when he comes back. And so we've read, still up on screen there, that the Lamb, you know who the Lamb is, don't you? The Lamb is the light of heaven. We read that the Lamb is the temple, the new heavenly version of Jerusalem. He's the temple there. It's the Lamb who sits on the throne in that new city too. Final chapter of all, Revelation 22. The angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Verse 3. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. And that carol that starts off the famous service from King's Chapel has got it right. It's the one that has started off every one of those famous services of carols and readings since they started. At this time of year, we do look back to the coming King. You know the first carol, don't you? Once in Royal David City, which of course is where that king did come. There did stand that lowly cattle shed. Whatever arrangement it actually was, the details are a bit fuzzier than we typically remember or realise, I think. But those words are sung, those sung words resonating around King's College Chapel. That marks the start of Christmas proper for some. But the final words of that carol mark the end of history proper, when the coming King has come again, and earth has finally received her King. Remember that last verse? This is all very poetic. I need to jumble them around and unjumble. Not in that poor lowly stable with the oxen standing by, we shall see him but in heaven, set at God's right hand on high. And that's all, that's put together poetically. I need to sort of just straighten it out of it so we know what we're saying here. Same words, but in a more prose kind of word way. We shall see him not in that poor lowly stable with the oxen standing by, but we shall see him in heaven, set at God's right hand on high. And here is amazing grace. In heaven, at God's right hand on high, there is room for you and me, where like stars his children crowned all in white shall wait around, because of the coming King. Because of the King who will have finally come again. Not as a baby in a manger, not even as the one born King of the Jews, but as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Because of that King, because of Jesus. Folks, let's pray.